The wind had stopped that night, and when Carl looked up from the hood of his truck, he noticed something he'd never felt before. Silence so complete, it seemed to press against his ears like water. Carl was a mechanic, 43 years old, worked alone in a garage on Route 9 just outside of a town called Mercer, population 217. His hands were stained with oil. His back ached from years of bending over engines, and his heart carried a weight. He never spoke about his daughter, Emma, had died 3 years ago in a car accident, and since then he had lived like a man underwater, moving slowly, speaking rarely, feeling nothing. Carl wiped his hands on a rag and stood beneath the floodlight in front of his shop, staring at the empty highway that stretched into the dark hills beyond, and that was when he saw it, a light hovering above the tree line, not like a plane or a helicopter, but something else, something that pulsed softly, like a heartbeat. The color shifted between gold and silver, and as Carl watched frozen in place, the light began to descend slowly, deliberately, as if it knew he was there. The air around him grew warm, then cold, then warm again, and his chest tightened, not with fear, but with something closer to recognition, as though his soul had been waiting for this moment his whole life without knowing it. The light touched down in the field across the road from his garage, settling into the tall grass without sound, without disturbance, and Carl felt his legs carry him forward. Even though his mind told him to run, he crossed the road, stepped over the ditch and walked into the field, his boots crunching on dry earth, and when he was 20 feet away, the light faded, and what remained was a figure standing in the grass, tall and luminous, not made of flesh but not made of light either. Something in between. The figure did not speak. At first, it simply watched him, and Carl felt exposed, like every lie he had ever told, every moment of anger, every hour spent hating God for taking his daughter was visible, written across his skin, and yet the figure did not judge it, only waited, and then without words, Carl heard a voice not in his ears, but inside his chest, deep and resonant, like the hum of the earth itself. The voice said, "I have been here before." Carl could not speak. His throat was tight. His eyes burned with tears he did not understand. And the figure continued, "We have always been here, walking among you, watching, guiding. When we are allowed, some call us angels, some call thus travelers, some call us demons. But we are none of those things. We are messengers, and we have come because the time is close." Carl's knees buckled, and he sank into the grass. His hands pressed against the dirt, and he whispered close to what the figure stepped closer. And now Carl could see that it had no face, only the suggestion of one, a smoothness where eyes and a mouth should be. And yet he felt its gaze pierce through him to what you have been waiting for. The voice said, the transformation, the return, the moment when heaven and earth are no longer separated. Carl shook his head, tears streaming down his face. "I stopped believing," he said, his voice cracked and raw. "I stopped believing when she died." The figure knelt beside him and reached out one hand, hovering just above Carl's shoulder, and warmth spread through him like sunlight breaking through clouds. "Belief is not a thought," the voice said. "It is a frequency, a vibration. You never stopped believing, Carl. You only stopped listening." Carl looked up at the figure, his vision blurred, and he saw something impossible. The figure's form flickered, and for just a moment, Carl saw wings vast and made of light folded against its back, and then the wings were gone, and the figure was simply there again, still and calm. "You think we are strangers," the voice continued, "but we are not. We have walked with you since the beginning. We were there in the garden. We were there at the tomb. We were there when the sky opened and the Son of Man ascended, and we will be there when he returns." Carl wiped his face with trembling hands. "Why me?" he asked. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you are ready," the figure replied, "and because you have suffered, and suffering opens the door that joy cannot." Carl sat back on his heels, staring at the figure, his mind spinning with questions. But the voice spoke again before he could form the words. "You want proof," it said. "You want to know if this is real or if you are losing your mind." Carl nodded. The figure stood and gestured toward the sky. "Look," it said, and Carl looked up. The stars were moving, not falling or shooting across the sky, but rearranging themselves, forming patterns he had never seen before, shapes that felt ancient and familiar all at once. And then the sky opened, not with fire or violence, but with a softness like curtains parting, and Carl saw beyond the veil. He saw worlds upon worlds spinning in harmony. He saw beings of light moving between them. He saw threads connecting every living thing, a web of energy and intention. And at the center of it all he saw a figure radiant and terrible and beautiful, a figure with arms outstretched and wounds in his hands, and Carl knew without being told that this was the one. The figure beside him spoke. Again, he has never left. The voice said, he has been here all along, waiting for the moment when you would be ready to see him. The vision faded, and the sky returned to normal stars, scattered across the black like scattered diamonds, and Carl felt something break open inside. His chest a dam that had been holding back 3 years of grief and rage and doubt. He sobbed into his hands, his whole body shaking, and the figure placed its hand on his shoulder, now solid, now warm, and the touch was like fire, not burning but purifying. You will not remember all of this, the voice said, but you will remember enough and you will change, not because you were commanded to, but because you have seen, and once you have seen, you cannot go back. Carl looked up, his face wet, his eyes red, and he asked, what do I do now? The figure stood and began to walk back toward the place where the light had landed. You live, the voice said. You love, you forgive, you wait, and when the time comes, you will know. Carl watched as the figure stepped into the air and dissolved into nothing. The field was empty again. The night was silent again, and Carl was alone, but not alone. Something inside him had shifted, something fundamental. He stood slowly, his legs weak, and walked back across the road to his garage. The floodlight flickered as he passed beneath it, and he stopped, turned and looked back at the field for a long moment. He stood there searching for some sign, some proof that what he had experienced was real, and then he saw it. A single blade of grass in the center of the field, glowing faintly like an ember. Carl smiled for the first time in 3 years. He smiled, and he went inside. The next morning, Carl opened his shop at the usual time. A customer came in asking for an oil change, and Carl did the work. Without complaint, without impatience, he listened when the man talked about his sick mother, and when the man left, Carl did not charge him. A week later, a woman came in her car, making a terrible rattling sound. Carl fixed it, and when she tried to pay, he told her to buy her kids something nice instead. People began to notice something had changed in Carl. He did not preach, he did not speak of what he had seen, but there was a kindness in him now, a stillness that had not been there before, a light that seemed to shine from somewhere deep within. And when people asked him what happened, he would only say, I remembered something I had forgotten months past. And Carl continued his quiet work, fixing engines, helping strangers, living in a way that felt both ordinary and sacred. And then one night as he was closing up the shop, he heard a voice behind him. Carl. He turned and saw a man standing in the doorway, a man he did not recognize but whose face seemed familiar. The man smiled. I wanted to thank you, he said, for what Carl asked for. Listening, the man said, and without another word he turned and walked into the night. Carl stepped outside and watched the man disappear into the darkness, and then he looked up at the sky. The stars were steady tonight, unmoving, but Carl felt the same presence he had felt that night in the field, the same warmth, the same knowing. He whispered into the night, I am ready, and somewhere far above, or perhaps deep within, a voice answered. We know. Carl went back inside, turned off the lights and locked the door, and as he drove home through the empty hills, he felt something he had not felt in years. Peace, not the absence of pain, but the presence of something greater, something that had always been there, waiting for him to stop running and start listening. And he thought to himself, maybe the miracle was never about seeing angels or lights in the sky. Maybe the miracle was this, the quiet transformation, the return to love, the remembering that we are not alone, that we have never been alone, that the universe is not cold and indifferent, but alive and aware and infinitely compassionate. Carl pulled into his driveway and sat in his truck for a moment, staring at the small house where he had lived alone for so long, and he realized he was not afraid anymore, not of death, not of loss, not of the unknown, because he had seen beyond the veil, and what he had seen was not an ending, but a beginning. Years later, when Carl was an old man lying in a hospital bed, his body failing, but his mind clear, a nurse asked him if he believed in heaven. Carl smiled, his eyes distant, as if looking at something she could not see. I do not believe, he said softly. I know the nurse did not understand, but Carl did not explain. There was no need, because some truths cannot be taught. They can only be experienced. And Carl had experienced the truth that night in the field beneath the light that came from beyond the stars. He had been touched by something eternal, something that called itself a messenger, but felt like grace, and he had been changed not all at once, but slowly, like a seed planted in dark soil. that takes time to grow. And when Carl closed his eyes for the last time, he saw the figure again, standing at the foot of his bed, luminous and calm, and the voice spoke once more. "Welcome home," it said, and Carl understood that home was not a place, but a state of being, a frequency, a vibration, the same one he had felt that night when the wind stopped and the stars sang, and as his heart beat its final rhythm, Carl felt himself lift, rising not up but inward, collapsing into the light that had always been inside him, and he saw the one with the wounded hands, waiting arms open, and Carl stepped forward and was embraced, and in that embrace he felt every soul that had ever lived, every being that had ever loved, every particle of creation connected and whole, and he realized that the aliens and the angels had always been the same, that the messengers came in many forms, but carried only one message: that we are loved, that we are known, that we are not separate from the divine, but part of it, woven into the fabric of existence, like threads in a tapestry. And Carl laughed a sound of pure joy, because he finally understood the truth, that miracles are not interruptions of the natural order, but revelations of it, that the strange and the sacred are not opposites, but companions, that the universe is not a machine, but a song, and we are the notes, and somewhere on a lonely highway in a small town called Mercer, a mechanic named Carl once saw a light in a field, and his life was never the same, and maybe that is all a miracle, is a moment when the veil grows thin, and we catch a glimpse of what has always been true, that love is the gravity that holds the stars in place, that faith is not belief in the absence of evidence, but trust in the presence of mystery, that heaven is not above us, but within us, waiting to be remembered. Truth or fiction, maybe even the teller of this story does not know. Here stories exist to touch you and make you reflect. The magical only reveals itself to those who allow themselves to feel, not to those who insist on searching for certainties. But this is not where the story ends, because stories like these never truly end. They ripple outward, touching lives in ways we cannot measure or predict. 10 years after Carl's death, a young woman named Sarah drove through Mercer on her way to nowhere. In particular, she had left her job, her apartment, her entire life behind. After a diagnosis that gave her 6 months to live, she was angry, bitter, and tired of pretending to be brave. Her car broke down on Route 9 just as the sun was setting, and she coasted into the parking lot of an old garage that looked abandoned. But when she got out, she saw a light on inside, and a young man, maybe 25, came out wiping his hands on a rag. "You need help?" he asked, his voice kind. Sarah nodded, trying not to cry. The young man, whose name was Daniel, looked at her car and told her it would take a few hours to fix, and that she should rest inside while he worked. He brought her coffee and a blanket, and as he worked, Sarah watched him, noticing the way he moved with care and patience, as if every bolt and wire mattered. After a while, she asked him how long he had owned the place. Daniel smiled and said he did not own it. His grandfather had left it to him when he passed away. He told her stories about Carl, about how he had changed later in life, how he had become someone. People came to not just for car repairs, but for something else, something harder to name, peace maybe, or hope. Daniel said his grandfather never explained what had happened to him, but that he had left behind a journal full of writings about light and stars, and the thread that connects all living things. Sarah felt something stir in her chest, a curiosity she thought had died with her diagnosis. She asked if she could read the journal, and Daniel hesitated but then nodded, and brought it to her from a locked drawer in the back office. The journal was old, the pages yellowed and filled with Carl's handwriting, rough and slanted but honest. Sarah read by the light of a single lamp, and as she read, she felt tears streaming down her face, because Carl had written about fear and loss, and the night he had been visited by something he could not name, but that had changed him forever. He wrote about how he had learned that death was not an ending, but a doorway, and that love was the only thing that passed. Through it unchanged, Sarah stayed in that garage all night reading, and when the sun rose, Daniel found her asleep in the chair, the journal open on her lap. He gently took it from her hands, and when she woke, he handed her the keys to her car and told her there was no charge. Sarah tried to protest, but Daniel shook his head. "My grandfather used to say that some repairs are not about the car. He said they are about the person driving it." Sarah left Mercer that morning, but she did not go back to the city to die. Instead, she drove west into the desert, and she stopped at a place where the land stretched endlessly in all directions. And she got out of her car and looked up at the sky, and she screamed at God, at the universe, at whatever might be listening, and she demanded to know why her, why now, why this, and the sky did not answer. But something else did, a warmth that spread through her chest, a knowing that came not from her mind, but from somewhere deeper, and she heard a voice, not with her ears, but with her soul, and it said, "You are loved, you have always been loved, and you will always be loved." Sarah fell to her knees in the sand, and she wept. And when she finally stood hours later, she felt lighter, as if something had been lifted from her. She drove back to the city, and she went to her doctors, and the scans showed something impossible. The tumor was smaller, the cancer was retreating, and no one could explain it. But Sarah knew, she knew that miracles were not about defying nature, but about aligning with it, that healing came not from fighting, but from surrendering to the truth that we are not separate from the divine, but part of it. She lived another 30 years, and in that time she told the story of Carl and the journal, and the night she screamed at the stars and received an answer. And people listened, some believed and some did not. But it did not matter, because the story was not meant to convince, it was meant to awaken, and it did again and again, rippling outward across time and space, touching lives in ways no one could measure. Because that is what stories do, they carry light from one soul to another, and somewhere in the fabric of existence, in the space between stars and cells, between thought and breath, the messengers watch and wait, and when the time is right, they come not to save us, but to remind us of what we have always known, that we are not alone, that we are not forgotten, that the universe is not silent but singing, and we are part of the song. And maybe that is the truth about miracles. They are not interruptions. They are invitations, invitations to remember, to awaken, to see beyond the veil that separates the sacred from the mundane, the eternal from the temporary, the love that binds all things from the fear that divides them. And so the story continues, passed from one person to another, from one generation to the next, a thread of light woven through the tapestry of human experience, connecting us all, reminding us that we are more than flesh and bone, more than fear and doubt, more than the roles we play and the masks we wear. We are beings of light having a human experience, and the messengers, whatever we choose to call them, angels, aliens, ancestors, are here to guide us home, not to a place, but to a state of being where love is the only law and grace is the only truth. And when the final moment comes, when the sky opens and the Son of Man returns with wounds in his hands and light in his eyes, we will recognize him not as a stranger, but as the one we have always known, the one who walked with us through every valley and every triumph, the one who whispered in the silence and sang in the storm, the one who loved us before we knew love, and will love us long after we have forgotten our own names. Because that is the truth about miracles. They are not rare. They are everywhere, waiting to be seen by those who have eyes to see and hearts to feel and the courage to believe, not in the absence of doubt, but in the presence of wonder, truth, or fiction. Maybe even the teller of this story does not know. Here stories exist to touch you and make you reflect. The magical only reveals itself to those who allow themselves to feel, not to those who insist on searching for certainties.